Hello and welcome to the second and final day of the TRT World Forum 2021, Power and Paradox, Understanding Grand Strategy in the 21st Century. We're glad to have you with us here in our virtual venue in Istanbul, where we are all invited to participate, either from within our panel discussions and roundtables or online. Remember, you can send us your comments and questions in real time at trtworldforum.com. I'm Andrea Sanke, and I have the pleasure of convening our first panel today, Digital Governance, Policymaking and Statecraft in the Digital Age. That encompasses a lot of territory, not least how governments are learning to deal with misinformation campaigns, the power and influence of big tech companies, the mass harvesting of data, and of course, vulnerability to cyber attacks. Now, it's all changed the game of governance, and over the next 90 minutes, we'll look at how our legislators and leaders are having to adapt to this new and constantly evolving landscape. And now I have the honor of introducing my distinguished panel today. Madeleine de Kock-Boening is Vice President of Public Policy for Europe, the Middle East, and Africa at Netflix. Samir Saran is the President of the Observer Research Foundation. Stéphane Duguin is the Chief Executive Officer of the CyberPeace Institute. And joining us very shortly is David Carroll, Associate Professor of Media Design at Parsons School of Design. Thanks all so much for being with us. You know, one of the biggest challenges facing governments today is how to legislate around cybersecurity issues and to fight cyber attacks. Samir, I'll start with you. It is a huge problem, especially where you are based in India. First, give us some examples of, what countries like India are up against and how governments need to legislate and cooperate in order to fight it.
Thank you for having me, and I really look forward to learning from my other distinguished panelists on a question that that poses many queries but has very little responses. Let me try and give you a glimpse of what we are trying to respond to in India. So I think the first challenge of statecraft, or rather protecting your sovereign space in cyberspace, is that information does not recognize borders, laws and jurisdictions do. So in many ways, we are up against combating a trend that is different to any other that we have seen in the past century. A simple example, there is an asymmetry of information landscapes. In India, for example, we have a fairly open information space which allows all comers to participate in our domestic conversations. You can join in, any of the other panelists can comment on my tweets, on my articles, on my views, on my commentaries, can challenge a prime minister, can criticize our cabinet ministers, and can challenge our policies and political positions as well. I don't think the Indians can participate in the Chinese public sphere. So for example, the first challenge for us is that you have open systems facing closed societies. And that allows closed societies to infiltrate and game your political conversations while denying you reciprocity. It is an equivalent, a 20th century equivalent would be that if the Chinese were to have an embassy in India and we were not to allow we were not to be allowed an embassy in China. So you throw out the American diplomat, but want to have a Chinese diplomat in Washington, DC. I think it's that equivalent. The Chinese participate in our space. We cannot participate in their spaces. Their public sphere, their digital public sphere is closed. And there is an asymmetry of information that is changing security dilemmas. That is the first. The second is the non-state actor. I think the non-state actors today have the ability to game politics, have the ability to shape economics, and have the certainly the tools and wherewithal to many ways reshape the social and cultural consensus in many geographies. So you're seeing radicalization of all forms. You're seeing illiberalism of all varieties. You're seeing the cancel cultures from the left. You're seeing the rigidities of the right. You're seeing the loonies on every side of the spectrum become center stage in the digital realm. So the center is not holding. The center space, which was meant to be the sensible space, today has shrunk, and the margins and the periphery have become the dominant discourse in the digital domain. How do you respond to this, especially if you're 1.4 billion people and everyone believes they're a minority in the 1.4 billion people? How do you start creating a new social contract, a new political consensus in this changing landscape? And finally, I think this is equally important. I think the idea of state, of the nation being the principal actor, respondent, and in many ways the security provider in the digital space is perhaps flawed. I think those days are the 20th century, have ended with the 20th century. We now need a far more sophisticated model of managing this new age. I think the private sector has to take far greater responsibility. We need accountable boardrooms. We need a new partnership between civil society, researchers, professors, academia, and the private sector. And of course, citizens have to be at the center of any new consensus that emerges. Something that we have always found it very difficult to do, not only in Europe and America, but certainly even in the emerging economies. Citizens were to be protected and to be looked after by the patriarchal and rather parochial old systems. And we are finding it difficult to imagine that the non-state today is perhaps more powerful than the state itself.
Interesting. Let me turn to Madeleine. You know, cyber attacks are often aggressive and sudden, but what can be arguably be equally destructive is the very insidious effect of, you know, online disinformation and misinformation. It's sometimes called fake news. It's far harder to legislate something that many people actually equate with free speech. So let me ask you, is there a way, do you think, to get the balance right?
Wow, that's a tough question, and thank you for having me here. I'm like in my other job, I'm an academic, so I can talk a little bit to that point as well. As you might know, we have created, with subsidy of the European Commission, etmo.eu. That is a place where we help to combat disinformation, and we're doing that by making sure we will get a lot of media literacy going on, so people are more digitally savvy. They realize that it's important to tap into different information sources and not just stay in their information filter bubble. And at the same time, also make sure that there is academic and fact-checking scrutiny against the disinformation that is shared. So there is like a whole debate on how we can get that right. I would say we have to be very careful with throwing away the baby with the bathwater, where we would actually decide to say, well, you know, we're gonna censor this information because we don't want the states to start deciding what is a fact or what is not a fact, especially because a lot of the impact of disinformation is exactly caused by the less trust in state actors. At the same time, we also don't want private actors such as GAFA, the large big tech, which we as Netflix are not part of, obviously, to decide what are facts or not. So I'm very much in favor of creating more society resilience as opposed to having like scrutiny, censorship by either state actors or private actors, because we really want to get it right. And we don't want to contribute to what the former speaker was also saying, to having more extremism, having more extreme right and extreme left. We need a place for the political middle, and therefore we need to start building trust on those actors that are involved, both the private actors and the state actors. But if you don't mind, I would also like to talk a little bit against what we are doing as Netflix in this space, because I think there is also a very positive story to tell about how the new digital transformation can actually very much contribute in a positive way. So maybe you know that Netflix is a service that is just editorial. So we do not have any editorial we do not have any user-generated content. So therefore also the disinformation space is not relevant for Netflix. We do not have any ads, advertisement. So we're also not competing with media in that sense. And we're also making sure that we do not have a business model that is pivoting towards those information bubbles. We have very strong ratings, so parents can watch out what they see ahead of that, as well as strong parental control. So you can also avoid that your children are watching things you don't want to watch. But if you look at the
Okay.
digital transformation of our business, as you might know, we started as Netflix as a DVD by email company in the 1990s. And from there, we leaned into the digital transformation. And now we have more than 200 million subscribers worldwide. We make consumers be able to choose what they want, when they want, and on which device they want to watch content. And what we also see, and that's maybe even more important also economically, the marriage of content and technology has really changed the distribution. So what we see is, and therefore I think Turkey is a fantastic example of that, that local content is now able to travel worldwide and thereby tapping into new audience that were formerly not tapped into before. So what we would see is made in Turkey, loved by the world. And I think a very nice example of that is The Protector. This series was based on a fantastic novel, and that translate into English, because I will not bother you with my lousy Turkish pronunciations. It's a strange story of charcoal and young man. And what you would
Seen
see
it,
that this
yeah.
is like, this is cultural. Thank you. This is cultural heritage
It's
that we
really,
are
it's
able also to
remarkable.
translate globally.
It is remarkable. I mean, I do have to, I don't want to give so much credit to a commercial institutions, but it is amazing to see, a base like Netflix be able to give this kind of cultural enlightenment to the rest of the world, being able to give the entertainment of all these various individual countries and cultures to the entire globe on a platform that's so easy and accessible. But Madeline, if I can, I want you to put your academic hat back on and ask you if we
Okay,
have
will
ever
do.
seen, okay, if we've ever seen a time before when the lightning fast, spread of conspiracy theories and fake news and misinformation has actually kind of threatened, arguably threatened public safety in the way some say it is now. I mean, do we have any previous lessons to really draw from in this cyber age?
Yeah, what I would say is, of course, disinformation is of all days, right? So it is also a way for governance, for instance, to pivot the public opinion in their favor. But of course, the scale right now is really way bigger than it was ever before. And I would say that also the fact that people can end up into their filter bubbles where they would just read their information through their social media outlets and not read any other media anymore. They will really start believing that this information is true. So that, for instance, taking a vaccine will make you crazy, or things like that, that are obviously really dangerous for our public health. But people start believing in that because they are in that filter bubble where they really have this confirmation bias going on. I would say I strongly believe, for instance, in public service broadcast as a way to counter with factual information, with scientifically evidenced information, that kind of confirmation bias of that things that are really certainly not true and that are dangerous both for public health and also for our democracies. So I would say the question is, did we ever see it? Yes, of course, we saw this information. Did we ever see this scale? No, and especially this confirmation bias, these filter bubbles that exist through the social media networks really make it pretty dangerous. And therefore, we really have to all buckle up to make sure that our citizens worldwide are also confronted with those new news and scientific outlets that are actually based on facts, so that they can make up their own mind and that they are fully distracted by this tiny piece of the world as they are willing to see it right now.
Okay, okay. First of all, David Carroll, I'm glad you could join us. I just want to introduce you, David Carroll, Associate Professor of Media Design at Parsons School of Design. He made it to the panel, so glad you're with us. I'm going to get to you, David, in just a second, but Stéphane, I'm pretty sure I saw you, you did have a comment. on what Madeleine was saying. If I'm not mistaken, you did. Go ahead if you wanted to say something at this time. If not, I do actually have a separate question for you.
But it was really on something that was mentioned when it comes to the new type of the threat, and thank you for having me in this panel. There's something happening. The technology is quite linked to change the threat landscape. It's Madeleine was mentioning this echo chambers, this siloed space of information, but it's also fueled and helped by algorithm amplification. So the fact that the content that's presented to the audience is really dependent on activity that is done in black boxes by algorithm in order to select and provide content to the audience. And this also has a clear impact and effect on the, driving along into your own bubble of understanding and missing even the curiosity to look into other facts. So I just wanted to comment on this, but please.
Okay. You know what, Stéphane, while I have you, let me take a step back with you just for a minute. I want to ask a more personal, arguably simpler question. Why has an institute, your institute, been created for CyberPeace? Where and when did you spot the necessity to build this type of organization? Because I think it might actually get to the foundation of what we're talking about today.
Thank you for the question. I'll give you a practical example. If today you go online, and I mean the viewers can just play that game, you go on a search engine and you type the big names of the big attacks, the big cyber attacks of the past decade, 20 years. So you type WannaCry, or you type NotPetya, you type SolarWinds, you type Kaseya. If already you know what I'm talking about, it's already something. But what you're going to get as a result in images is image of computer, image of codes, numbers, so much money was lost, the impact on the network was this one. What you will not see at all is victims, what is happening to people. And then the whole logic for the CyberPeace Institute was to go beyond the ambition of cybersecurity. I mean, the challenge that we are facing is not about securing systems, it's not about protecting computers. The challenge is about protecting people. And in order to protect people, we need to understand what these attacks and the blend in between cyber attacks, disinformation, hybrid threats is having a societal impact on population. And the CyberPeace Institute mission as a non-for-profit NGO in Geneva is to provide free services to vulnerable communities, to the victims, to the targets, and making sure that what is happening to them, what is the cost to society of these attacks is known, is documented, that we are publishing evidence about these attacks, and that this base of evidence is used by policymakers in order to change, the rules of the game. I mean, we see for years that cybercrime, cyber attacks are accelerating at the speed of light, but at the same time, the response is not even at the speed of law. And I mean, it's an asymmetry that is impossible to bear if you look at this from the victim point of view. Example of what we did in the CyberPeace Institute, to your question in terms of the why we have been set up, we focused a lot, for obvious reason, on protecting healthcare last year. What we could see at the peak of the first pandemic, there was one attack per day on healthcare capabilities. At the peak of the pandemic, I mean March 2020. That's just impossible to conceive. And so imagine a related case. You would have a armed group, people with weapons, coming into a hospital. They would get all the ideas, all the passport of all the patients. They would break the computers, they would close the door, and they would say, beginning now, until we have money, no one comes in, no one comes out, and you cannot deliver care. And that would happen once per day. I'm pretty sure the treatment of this fact would be way different than what happened back then when there was one cyber attack per day with exactly the same effects on the healthcare. And we believe in the CyberPeace Institute that knowledge is power here. We want to make sure that people are empowered with the knowledge to hold states, private sector, and others accountable for what they need to do to secure their interests, to secure the populations. So that's why very recently we published the Cyber Incident Tracer. You can find this on our website, where we provide for free to all communities, from researchers to journalists, but more importantly to victims, about the reality of today's cyber attack on healthcare. And believe it or not, this was not existing. And believe it or not, it's very complicated to find information just to make this landscape of what is happening to healthcare. And we have in the Institute to investigate the dark net the whole day in order to see what criminals are talking about, what kind of data they sell. And when we see that they're selling data, millions of patient records, then you can realize that a hospital has been attacked. Because, I mean, capacity is missing, reporting is scarce, and as long as we don't have this basic knowledge of the threats, it's going to be very difficult to drive change.
Right. Let me get David Carroll into the conversation here. And if you can, help us understand another layer of this, and that is the so-called power of big tech companies today, and whether they need to be reined in. Those who control the ever more influential social media platforms, in particular Mark Zuckerberg, are increasingly being painted as villains. I mean, do you think they are villains? Do they have too much power? And if they do you think they really actually wanted to be in that position?
Well, thank you. I'm glad to be here and to join this panel. On the question in particular of Zuckerberg, I think it's important to revisit the notion that he is not bound by the typical corporate governance that would normally keep a company under control. When the first investor in Facebook, Peter Thiel, set up Facebook, he did so to make sure that Mark Zuckerberg would essentially be a corporate autocrat, and many other tech companies have been founded with this structure. And so there's almost zero internal accountability to Facebook, which leads toward a kind of corporate imperial vision. And we see that playing out. And now we see it playing out in the challenge of reining the company in, especially at the US congressional and regulatory level. We see that the lawmakers here and the regulators here do not have a clear pathway to find a solution. And there is no single solution. There's probably a collection of solutions that range across privacy and data protection regulation, antitrust enforcement, and some of the issues related to how algorithmic amplification potentially relates to product safety or consumer liability. Because the US has the First Amendment, that will certainly complicate and prevent, by its design, any overreach by government to limit the capabilities of speech and business. But this will also become the key challenge to find solutions where other nations that don't have a First Amendment will not be restricted in the same ways. So I think this is a difficult problem that we're watching the United States and other countries work through. And we've also seen how the internal employees at Facebook are participating in leaking documents to journalists who then create whistleblower stories. We're seeing like cycles now, news cycles of whistleblowing. The frustration internally of employees who, despite their best efforts, are then sort of quashed by the executives. And so out of frustration, they violate their non-disclosure agreements and leak to the press. So there's internal disputes going on at the company itself. And currently, I would say the employees have the most power, more power than the governments, to reveal bad behavior because the companies are not required to disclose adequately. So these are big issues. When we look at the disclosures, the whistleblower documents, we see how the business model has driven all of the design decisions. There is a pursuit of quantity and power at all costs. And even when internally they discover the harms that their platform causes, they do not act. So we have continued to see many stories now of this problem. And the question of Mark Zuckerberg's power is unresolved.
It's unresolved. I mean, is it the classic problem, really, David, of the law always being, at least a step or two behind the technology?
Probably worse than that, that there are business people who want to subvert the law and override it. And Peter Thiel is very characterized by developing mechanisms to nullify the role of government. That's a deliberate activity in the way that he structures companies. And so I think we have glorified founders in the United States to a terrible fault and allowed individual business people to become too powerful and deferred to business too much. And now we have significant human rights issues all around the world that are the responsibility of an American company, and we don't know how to fix it. And the executives deceive and lie to lawmakers and regulators. And then they just pay the fines when they get caught. It's as a cost of doing business. So we do not have the tools to rein the companies in. And we are using the tools that are available, as imperfect as they are, in a political situation that is itself fragmented and made more radicalized by the tools themselves. Politicians rely on Facebook to stay in power, and that they have to be the ones to regulate the company.
Yeah. Samir, I want to come back to you and get your thoughts on what you've just heard, especially, the idea of glorified founders, which I'm going to come out and say those are kind of a pillar of, well, especially American capitalism. We love those stories, and they seem to be admired very much so in the business community.
So I think this is the paradox of power in the 21st century. You have unaccountable power, and I think that's what David was basically suggesting in his intervention. And you don't seem to have either the political capital or the legislative means to rein that power in. And let me just add to that. And power today is using a politically polarized ecosystem to further its own agenda. So, for example, maybe a couple of decades ago, you might have had a Democrat-Republican consensus to cut them down to size. And I don't know if David would agree with me, but perhaps a few decades ago, there might have been some sort of a consensus amongst the lawmakers to propose difficult and tough laws to make boardrooms more accountable, certainly the big names, but also other companies, by the way, who are even more dangerous because we don't even know them yet. So that's the first challenge. The second, of course, is that I am worried about this development for a simple reason. In the previous years, if someone provided you food, security, allowed you to engage with your family, connected you with your society, shaped your politics, also offered you insurance and protection, you would normally have elected them. Now we don't. Now all of my existential needs are provided by private actors who are above the law, or rather who are out of reach of the law. The way they have structured themselves is in a manner that no single jurisdiction has powers to regulate them down, or I think down is the wrong word, but regulate them to size. 1898, I remember there was a big hue and cry, turn of the previous century, the big hue and cry around Standard Oil, if I remember, and multiple headed Hydra cartoons and news stories resulted in the action a decade later on dismembering and dismantling the monopolistic reach and power and control of Standard Oil. I am wondering if in the 21st century, that kind of political action is possible in the US. And third point here is that I think perhaps US is the most fragile geography in taking on these very powerful actors. I think if you would have any of these actors in China, they would have realized very quickly how strong the state is, or maybe in Moscow, or maybe even in some other parts of the emerging world. I think it is the US system, particularly in the 21st century, that is finding it difficult to curtail the powers of these very big tech companies.
Okay. Stéphane, go ahead. I can see you had a comment.
No, building on what Samir was saying, which is extremely accurate. There's also something that I mean, there's a tendency to try to address this asymmetry with technology or with escalation, of how state can manage from the technological point of view against the companies. We should never undermine the power of values. I mean, look, 10 years ago, there was this scandal all over the world about gathering of personal data without any rule, without any rein, without anything. And in the end, the EU, took the approach of pushing something that was felt like crazy at the time with GDPR. People were thinking it's going to be only on the EU market. And in the end, it became a legislation that impacted the whole data processing and data collection globally. So things are possible if governments are taking, what is their role is to promote values and to make sure that they are, matching their mission, which is protecting population and the rights of population.
Yeah, I
Okay.
mean, a quick intervention. Sorry for hogging the mic. I think Margaret
No, go ahead.
Vestager would have cut Facebook down to size, or any of the big tech companies down to size. I think there is a certain kind of political class that exists outside the US today that is willing to take on big tech. And I don't want to personalize this. I think this is a broader challenge than just one or two or three individuals. And like I mentioned, many dangerous companies who are even more so because they are not even listed in public discourses yet.
Okay, Madeline, let me ask you then on that. Big tech, cybersecurity, they are, I guess, a threat to both, governments and private business. When it comes to cybersecurity in particular, we've already seen, the massive damage that hacking can cause, and we've seen these data breaches as well that deeply disturb the public psyche. Are authorities now, do you think, starting to establish better control mechanisms in general, or are you expecting actually worse to come as technology continues to develop?
That is a great question. So, I think first of all, I really liked very much the earlier interventions by both David and, well, everyone, Samir and also Stéphane. I think that is so on topic. One thing before I dive into the legislation, I think it's also important that we build on this societal resilience, and therefore, we have to make sure that editorial content is very much supported. So governments can also play a role in supporting the creation and a positive landscape for editorial content to make sure there is more societal resilience against, for instance, disinformation. I think that's one really important element that I cannot emphasize enough. And then on legislation, so, throughout my academic career, I have been working on how to legislate disruptive technology. And what I would say is, of course, to your earlier question, it's very likely that the law will always be a little bit behind the technological development. Maybe that's also good, because if you are ahead of the technological development, you might actually end up legislating exactly the wrong thing, because the technology will develop in another direction. So I think it's also good that you pause and think a bit, and at the same time make sure you will have self-regulatory or co-regulatory measures in place. And I think one of the examples of that worldwide first is the report that was created by the high-level group on disinformation that resulted of the European Union that resulted in the code of practice. So this code of practice is a first step where at least these platforms were put on the spot to actually, start taking measures. Is it enough? No, it's not enough. So therefore, we're ramping up those effects. And also to what Stéphane was just saying, I think it's very important that we realize the so-called Brussels effect. In Brussels, you would see this European Commission being very active on legislating, not just the GDPR, but also now on the Digital Service Act, the Digital Millennium Act, and even also on the AI regulations, where they're trying to find a good way between, helping innovation and protecting citizens at the same time. This is a highly debated legislative process, and I really trust that we will end up in the right spot, where the scope is exactly right, where we would have a good standard starting in Europe and then hopefully spreading more multilateral legislation, or even those big tech platforms. I mean, if they have to uphold those rules in Europe, they're very likely to also do that throughout the globe, because they already had to, adjust their business models there. So maybe it's a bit positivo, but I also really want to emphasize that it's is not just all black. I think especially the European Commission is really ramping up to take it to a next stage. And that's important and urgent, as also the earlier speakers have just reflected upon.
Okay, Stéphane, saw you had a comment very quickly, and then I'd like to go back to David. Go ahead.
No, it was an example that, I mean, it goes beyond big tech. So maybe it's also an opening question, is that we are seeing this as if there's a centralization in big tech about, the threat on the threat landscape. Also opportunities, but we're talking here about the threat. Now, look at the example of deepfakes. I mean, deepfakes has not been invented by any big tech. It's also how people all around the world are connecting each other because one day they have access to cheap processing power. That would happen in 2017 for deepfake. The same day they see that, okay, there's tons of photos out there that we can use for free. And the same day, TensorFlow is put open source on the internet. And then you have this collective brain that is like created in order to today engineer what is one of the worst threats to democracy, because you cannot even trust the media that is presented to you. And there, against regulation, and the example provided by Biden is excellent, should have the ambition beyond big tech to go into also technologies usage, to be sure that democratic foundation are not undermined by such innovation. So just to mention this.
Okay, I want to bring that up then with David. I mean, in the design space, how do you keep encouraging innovation and design without running into the territory where there are serious risks? I mean, deep fakes, for example. Right now, some of them are just funny. They usually, go after kind of entertainers, and then they're revealed very quickly. But if that technology keeps developing, that design keeps developing, what's at risk? What's at risk when it comes to people's, privacy, their reputations, et cetera?
Sure. This is a primary role that I teach in the school where I work, and many of my alumni students work in the tech industry in the role of designing the user interfaces and the user experiences. And in many ways, they are on the front lines of doing product safety, but they don't have the authority within the companies to express a kind of ethics of design. The designers are really just doing the bidding of the business units. So it's a big struggle in the field of design, because we realize that we need to develop a sense of ethics, but the business community doesn't have the framework to reorganize companies to orient around design ethics, for example. But interestingly, this is an element that's seeing new regulation. Even in the United States, we're seeing at the state level interest in regulating so-called dark patterns. These are user interfaces which are designed to manipulate people to do things they don't want to do. And they're incredibly effective at achieving the kind of growth strategies that drive tech businesses. And many of them are sort of driven on deceptive interfaces that manipulate people or trick people or nudge them into behaviors that they would not choose otherwise. And so we are seeing a kind of example of the interface itself being regulated as a product. That's something that's sort of right there on the surface that we can all see. The issue of deep fakes or synthetic media is a sort of natural progression of technology development. And what's interesting there is the industry has not responded in a way that makes sense to me. I would anticipate in the face of something like synthetic media that a standard of certifying authentic media as an industry standard, so that you could understand the provenance of a media inherent to its format, that you would design the format for authenticity. And it's notable that the industry just doesn't act on these things because there's not a profit center around them. So it's always the profitable business that goes first, meaning deceptive interfaces or synthetic media. And we're not thinking about ethics or product safety or authenticity or anti-fraud up front.
Yeah,
privacy,
I mean, David, I can't imagine.
Comes after, not first.
Right. That is going to be such a difficult space to start to monitor and start to try to legislate, especially. You talk about these dark patterns and the questions of ethics going forward. I'm wondering more about what obstacles you're going to run into because, people, let's be honest, people have always been manipulated. That's what advertising is basically about. It's about convincing us we need things that we might not necessarily need. An argument is made that that's why we have so much consumer debt, particularly in the United States, because people are spending on things they can't afford because they feel the need to constantly consume based on this advertising that we're sold and this constant rush to keep up with the Joneses, if I want to use a kind of a trivial phrase. So what are you most worried about going forward in this ethics sphere about these dark patterns and how you're going to convince people that they need to be kind of protected from themselves?
Well, we're seeing it play out at the state level, so we sort of have to wait for an enforcement action to see what the potential effects would be, meaning how is, for example, the Attorney General of California going to enforce violations of dark patterns? It would be an important moment for the whole digital design industry to see the first example of a kind of anti-consumer digital product be punished in a very specific way, and would that have a deterrent effect? Would it cause a ripple effect through the industry, and people started to realize, oh, we can get caught for doing these things, that they're not right. So we haven't even crossed the line yet where we've seen an enforcement action and the potential effects of that. But I look forward to seeing that, to see if it could sort of put the industry on notice that no, you can't get away with anything. Whatever makes the dashboard metric go up is acceptable. That there are practices that will be rejected, and those bright lines have to be drawn. They haven't been drawn yet, but they could be drawn soon. I guess I'm optimistic for that.
Okay, very interesting. Samir, I'll come back to you because we were talking more just now about kind of the consumer space and what might be at risk. I wanted to go back to you about what's at risk in government, in policy, in elections. Right now, it seems some social media platforms are being directly held responsible, actually, for misinforming the public or for spreading misinformation and disinformation. Do you think it's fair that those platforms are being held responsible? Or is it unfair because they can't be expected to control such massive, massive amounts of data going out that people, again, define as their freedom of speech on these private platforms?
So, let me very quickly also just add to something David said, because this has been worrying me for a few weeks now. We have a sort of a global understanding that the Pegasus issue led to a number of cases where people were eavesdropped upon, their calls were recorded, their conversations were monitored, and their private lives were scrutinized. We all now know, because there was this big global collective that came out with this news that was headlines in every big newspaper media outlet for days, and we all believe Pegasus happened. Now that's the current state of mind. Now assume in a few months from now, some bad actor decides to produce synthetic fake conversations, delegitimizing people around the world just because their names are on that list. We would believe it, even if they were deep fakes and synthetic productions, because we have in our mind the understanding that Pegasus happened and people were recorded and monitored and scrutinized. We would tend to believe many of these synthetic audio videos, whatever would be released. So I think we are also in this highly surcharged political ecosystem, which is very conducive to the propagation and fast consumption of many of these bad inventions or innovations. So I think it is also the politics that is driving the market, and not just the innovators who are working in isolation. And I think that's an important point. On your question, I think on social media, It's a million-dollar question. Now, if you are a platform, then typically under most intermediary rules around the world, you are not meant to exercise any editorial influence, which means that typically you are the host of content, and if there is a law and order issue around it from the jurisdiction, from any jurisdiction, because these are global platforms, you have to take it down, and beyond that you should not have editorial influence on content. That is the typical definition of an intermediary, of course much more nuanced and in far greater legal language, but that is what it is. Now the problem comes when in some instances, for advertisement purposes and revenue purposes, you are actually commercializing content and propagating and moving certain content faster and deeper around your networks. Now, if that content happens to be disputed, fake, synthetic, and dangerous, you are going to be, you are bound to be asked questions, because now not only are you a platform that hosts content, but you are also providing a service to that content by moving it across your networks at faster and deeper speeds. So I think you are bound to be questioned. So there is a degree of responsibility you can't evade if you are making money out of providing a service to the content that is housed on your platform. So that's the first point. The second is, if you were to get into the business of censoring certain content and not censoring other content, in this highly surcharged political ecosystem, your political agenda would also be questioned. Now, I think it's easy for any political party to say that my opposition is wrong and those who are opposed to me are bad people. But I think the fingers point both ways. So again, the role of the platform in a highly political planet that we reside in today is difficult. And sometimes the owner's prejudices, or even the algorithms that the previous speaker was mentioning, the black box algorithms that make decisions, need to be far more transparent and accountable. I think there needs to be a greater degree of clarity offered by platforms to the communities that they serve on why and how certain content is removed and other content is not removed. And unless you have a very clear, transparent, or what I call algorithm accountability, you are not going to be able to, you're always going to be criticized. And finally, I think it is going to be very difficult for a company housed in San Francisco, developing community rules for the extreme free speech ecosystem that the US has inculcated over centuries, to force many other jurisdictions that have conditional or conditions on free speech or caveats on free speech to accept those community standards. So I think the final challenge is that how do global platforms create quasi-jurisdictions in the communities that they serve? Let me give you a simple example. The BMWs all move at 300 kilometers an hour. Every country has different maximum speed limits. And guess what? My colony, where I live in, my housing colony, decides to hell with the law, to hell with jurisdiction, to hell with BMW. My children walk on the street, I will put rumble strips and I will slow the car down to 10 kilometers an hour. So eventually, I think we'll have to create a bottoms-up, community-led, and I think that's the point Madeline was making, a resilient community that is able to gradually exert influence on how technology serves them, and not at a macro level, but at the micro level, because it's individuals' lives that are being implicated. And just on this point, sorry, I'm taking too much time. I think it is important to understand that cyber security, cyber crime, cyber violence, cyber war is distancing the problem from the people. I think what happens in these domains is security, period, crime, period, dangerous, period. I think the minute you call it digital crime, digital security, digital terrorism, you are distancing it from the real world impact. This is our world. It is now one world. Real and virtual have collided. We have real implications of actions online. And I think it is time to drop the cyber and digital from our descriptions of what is security questions, society questions, privacy and human rights questions. I think these are deeply personal and now need to be brought into our lives rather than distanced.
Okay. I wonder, though, Madeleine, if it's as easy as, the community-based approach that Samir was describing when it comes to working in cyberspace, especially when you have cyberspace influencing government policy, even elections, interfering in elections, one country to another. Can the solutions be brought down to something much simpler, or no?
Yeah, what I would say is I very much agree with Samir that that is one of the important solutions, right? So I think we have to look at it in a multidimensional way. So one of the solutions is empower citizens for them to be able to make the right digital choices. If we don't do that, we really miss an opportunity. And at the same time, we also have to be getting very good at finding more transnational multilateralism solutions to these challenges. And of course, they are challenging to democracies. But I don't know whether you're aware of the research done by Oxford University that showed that, for instance, if you look at the US elections, that disinformation did not really move the needle. There was disinformation, but that was mainly consumed in the filter bubbles of people that were already prone towards one or the other direction. So we also have to be very good at academic research, finding out what exactly is the tough spot and then act against that. So I think that's also something that we have to realize. Maybe also pointing Samir at, and I'm absolutely not here to defend any of the big tech companies, obviously, but maybe like we don't want private actors like big tech to decide on what is true or false. However, Facebook has created this oversight board that is populated by independent people that are looking into the decisions of takedowns. And we have to wait and see whether they are stepping up to do a good job, because that is one of the things that Facebook is trying to do to get ahead of being the company that decides what to take down or not. Because of course we don't want private actors to play a role in that, apart from maybe taking a truly independent boards to onboard this exercise, and to also be critical about what is taken down and what is not taken down. And I think there is at least an effort of Facebook to do that with the oversight board. However, I would really recommend the audience, but also especially this panel, to be really critical about what is the output of this oversight board, because of course we don't want to have forms of window dressing where this is like a form where they would say, okay, we whitewash what we're doing by creating this oversight board, and at the same time still have the similar problem. So it's a solution. Is it the solution? I don't know. But I think, overall, to your question, we have to look at all the directions to really start finding solution for this really big societal problem.
Okay. Let me branch that out a little bit further. Stéphane, I'll come back to you. And how much you think, foreign governments now can be expected to cooperate when it actually comes to cybersecurity? It's a dark space that's also considered a national security tool, even a weapon for many that they would rather not rein in. What really are the challenges in trying to build international cooperation, particularly around fighting cybercrime together? I mean, how do we get countries to work together in order to protect one another in their common interest?
Thank you, and I would like to answer this building on what Samir was mentioning before, which I think is critical. A lot of time when we have conversation with different stakeholders on the cyberspace, internet, you name them, we're always explaining that there's a big misunderstanding at the bottom of everything, which is this is not virtual at all. So we are providing a support to NGOs in the humanitarian sphere that are under attack, under systemic and consistent attack. And these NGOs are in access to water, access to food, access to healthcare, access to energy, access to digital identity. So that's what we're talking about when we're talking about threats on cyber. So to your question, the role of states and international cooperation, and what are key points there. First, it's important that there's accountability on all actors. We talked a lot about the industry. Accountability level there is very important, but there's also huge accountability in states. There's a lot of rules already out there. It's also a second misconception. Like, it's the Wild West, nothing is existing. Not at all. There's a lot of laws and rules that are existing in order to make sure that responsible behavior is there when it comes to state activity when it comes to cyber means, and also how to regulate the activity of others, from civil society to industry. So the means are there, from the international law, the UN Charter of Trust, to recently United Nations Open-Ended Working Group and GGE coming up with norms, stating, for example, that healthcare is off limit, healthcare should not be attacked. Go back to our cyber incident tracer, and you're going to see that healthcare is still attacked at least 4 days, 4 times a week. So what is not working? It's the fact that as this capacity of attack and defense become a geopolitical asset, a geopolitical game, there's a lot of pledges, but then the actions are not following. Let's take one simple example. Offensive cyber capabilities. Samir was mentioning the Pegasus case just before. What is this about? It's about a unregulated market where private sector can research, develop, put in place, deploy tools which transform your phone, your computer in personal spies. So someone getting access to your device can hear what your microphone is hearing and can see what your camera is seeing and can look at your screen. So whatever encryption method you use, it's irrelevant because they have access to the screen. And this exists because states agrees that it's existing. Because there's no regulation. There's no regulation on research, there's no regulation on export, there's no regulation of use. Why? Because it creates this imbalance between the one that can negotiate with these companies to procure these tools. So it's public money that goes into public tender in order to invest into global cyber insecurity, because these companies are just building from the fact that there's holes in the internet. Let's exploit these holes against the population. So this lack of ambitions of states when it comes to regulating what is systemic threat to the cyberspace. The second bit is international cooperation. Cybercrime is by essence cross-border. So it needs international cooperation in between states in order to go against criminals. And there also the ambition is quite low in terms of resources for law enforcement, resources for the judiciary, enforcement of the processes that are, again, existing for cross-border exchange of information, mutual legal assistance. So again, it's always this difference between what the ambition of the states are putting out as window dressing sometimes, and the reality of what is happening in the field. So before reinventing the wheel, let's use the tools. And I would finish this with this. We published recently a coordination of a manifesto in the context of the new United Nations Cybercrime Treaty, and we put out this principle. Whatever treaty, it should not protect the states against the people. It should make sure that it is about protecting the victims of cyber attacks, and the first tone is not exactly like this.
Okay. David, if you had some comments, go ahead. If not, I have another question for you that's on a different track. Go ahead.
Well, I would just point to the challenge of, to the comment Samir made about that there are many regulations on the books. If only we could enforce them more effectively. And my own personal story is an example of that. I used UK data protection law, which was a progenitor of the GDPR, to require Cambridge Analytica to disclose its voter profile that it created on me for the US election in 2016. It had to do that because of extraterritoriality. That US voter data was processed in the UK meant that the UK had jurisdiction over our electoral data. The regulator, the Information Commissioner's Office, conducted a forensic investigation, but never published the full report or results. And in fact, I never got my full data set from the regulator, the ICO. I got my full data set by Channel 4 News. That some leaker leaked the 2016 database to an unknown person, and it got in the hands of journalists. And then a journalist showed up at my door and gave me my data file that I had been working years for and spent huge amount of legal costs for. So at the end of the day, we still need journalists and that robust practice of journalism to hold regulators accountable who are supposed to be holding businesses accountable. Regulators are failing at their job. And so how do we recognize the failings there, and how do we ensure that journalism remains as robust as possible to enable whistleblowing, to enable the appropriate use of leaking to hold everyone accountable, business and government.
Great. I'm going to come back to you, David, because I saw Madeline had a comment. Go ahead, Madeline.
Yeah. So I fully agree with David. I am so much in favor of journalism being strong as a part of like editorial content that can really, hold powers accountable. And I think governments really, can take a role in strengthening that. And if you would read, for instance, the report of the high-level group on disinformation from the European Commission that I was honored to be able to chair, you would also see that strengthening strong journalism is really one of the elements that will help us fight against disinformation and misuse of power by big tech.
David, then, does it worry you that, collectively a lot of faith has been lost in journalism because of the rise of fake news and people turning to social media as a source instead and being less and less trustful of what actual journalists produce? That's what cyberspace and that freedom of information from all over has brought us.
Yeah, this is an unfortunate byproduct of the social media business model, which seeks quantity at all costs and values quality with no verifiable impact. That the business model is simply to maximize engagement. It doesn't matter what is being engaged, and news stories are placed against cat pictures and family photos. So the user experience and the business model was part of the degradation of trust. And even the digital advertising business extracted value out of the journalism business. This is why what we've seen in Australia is unique, where news producers can now collectively bargain with the platforms to be remunerated for the value that's being extracted out of their business. So I think it has been a huge issue that the very business model of journalism has been disrupted by social media as an aspect of the declining in trust. The other thing that's important to realize that in the United States, local newspapers have collapsed over the past decade, and people gain the most trusted relationship with news at the local level. And the local newspapers have fallen out of business because digital advertising did not live up to its promise of maintaining the business models of news. If digital advertising had worked as it had promised, then local newspapers would not be going out of business across the country as we shifted to digital. So it's a systemic collapse. There's not a single reason for a decline in trust.
It's not just Australia took that step you just mentioned there, but I should have qualified it further in saying it's not just about a lack of faith in journalism, it's a lack of investment. There isn't enough real investment today in the hardcore journalism that kind of came to your rescue in your case with I believe, Channel 4 News, you had said. And Stéphane, I saw you wanted to comment as well. It really is a serious concern.
No, it is. Really quickly to totally seconding what Madeline and David were saying. In Institute, we put together some training session to journalists, really looking into the duality of journalism. On one end is being a target. Okay, journalists today are targets of attack, a very sophisticated attack, because they're active in, the coverage that they're trying to do, especially investigative journalism, is interesting a lot of parties. And I go back to what I was mentioning before. They're attacked by actors using an unregulated space where private companies are putting high-end malware against them. So it's about training journalists in how to detect, how to defend, how to protect. And on the other end is also discussing with journalists about the responsibility that they have when they tell stories about attacks. So that these stories are about the stories of people that are attacked and not the stories of computer. And that's also something that is quite important, because as long as we don't have this understanding by population, when we talk about cyber attacks, we talk about them. we talk about their basic human rights, then it's going to be complicated to move the needle, just to mention.
Okay, Madeline, go ahead.
Yeah, so to further two elements, I think this proves the importance of media and information literacy in the digital space, because I think we have to make people aware of the fact that quality news costs money, and that is very important for people to keep looking out for quality news to, to help reboost the investment in that sector. So I really would like to recommend to put a lot of effort in the knowledge of people that is really extremely important. At the same time, we also see exactly for the reason that Stéphane has just pointed out, that you would see that media sometimes, because they are under such a scrutiny and it's very difficult for them to keep their, to stay alive with very little advertisement money left, because they have this competition from social media that are advertising tailor-made, that they sometimes also lean into not a lot of time on fact-checking. So some media are even contributing, and I'm not saying all media, but we also have to be careful that media themselves also keep stepping up to the high quality of journalism standard, not to not to give fuel to that distrust in media that it's there. So I would say two-pronged approach for that, really making sure that our citizens understand the importance of editorial independent news and willingness to pay for that, and not just go for the free news on social media on the one hand, and on the other hand also having media realize that quality is really what sets them apart, and that would be really a great business model, way more than leaning into this really fast repetition of news that might even be a way where they would spread and purify this information unintentionally, always, of course, themselves.
Right. I mean, David, I think you'd agree, though, that's been a bit of an uphill battle lately, trying to convince people to really go after the quality rather than what's easiest.
Yeah, just reiterating how 20 years ago it was promised that if we could target ads digitally, that advertising would work better, it would create this incredible media ecosystem. Well, that didn't really happen. And here we are 20 years later, and we see the emergence of paywalls and low quality junk news. And so quality and news is becoming a luxury good similar to privacy. So we are really stratifying media into a two-tiered system where the affluent can pay for quality news and privacy, and everyone else gets junk, and their data is extracted in horrible ways to make the junk that they're consuming even worse. So we are sort of in a spiral of dysfunction because the business model has failed so spectacularly and is only exacerbating the problem, where you have sort of premium news being served to those who can afford it, and everyone else is getting bottom feeder content that's monetizing data to the lowest cost. It's a race to the bottom on one side and a race to the top on the other, and the middle is left with nothing.
Yeah. David, I'm going to stick with you. Or Samir, if you had a comment, quickly go ahead.
Yeah, just a quick comment. I think all media is not the same, and all journalists are not the same. So I think we are speaking about a very large community here. I think there are three distinct actors today in the media space. The first I call the echo chamber journalists. They are basically catering to the club they belong to, and in many ways are making those silos, as Madeline pointed out, more incestuous and closed to any other views and commentaries from outside. I think that's one thing that's clearly visible. We have the beat journalist is no longer about the sector they are covering, but the people they are catering to. So in that sense, that is one change that has happened. The second, of course, is, which I find highly distressing, is the whole new news business model, where every news, every piece of input any journalist offers is continuously assessed on a real-time basis. How many likes, how many retweets. You are perpetually being shaped by social media to produce what sells more rather than what is right. And I think the emphasis on longer legs rather than deeper insights is something disturbing. And I think that's a second trend. And you see a whole new generation of reporters, of editors, of opinion makers cater to this tendency. And finally, I think you have the real ones who are continuing with the fast dying art of journalism, and many of them you feel are being squeezed out, both from political as well as corporate support. And I think perhaps it is time for digital companies, and this is for David and Stéphane and Madeline to take forward. Perhaps it is time to ask all of these social media giants who have milked news cycles for their benefit to create a media fund that promotes and supports media training, journalists, scholarships for education, etc., etc. I think it's time to create a media fund from all the money the big tech platforms have made by using good news as the flags for selling fake news.
Interesting. David, I'm going to come back to you.
That's pretty much the Australian model. Yeah, this is the Australian model. How could news organizations collectively bargain to be compensated for the value that's been extracted? So the question is, will other countries adopt I think they call it the bargaining code model? And indeed, that money is supposed to fund some of the news producing benefits to society, whether through education or directly funding more news innovation. Other countries have proposed potentially a taxation. So taxing the use of personal data as a way to, first of all, price the externalities, and then also redirect funds to civil society appropriately. So, we're going to see different models experimented with, recognizing that the social media model is here to stay. So how can we recalibrate the extraction back to civil society somehow with either a bargaining or a taxation, some sort of mechanism that would potentially be fair? I wouldn't want to rely on the companies making philanthropic donations to journalism or academia. That creates way too many conflicts of interest. So there has to be some kind of neutral mechanism.
Okay. I mean, we are looking at one level of policy making there, but I really want to bring it back to governance itself, especially considering, our leaders and legislators are arguably being shaped more and more by social media. David, because you're in the United States, I'm going to address this with you. It's long been an issue with lobbyists in the United States having kind of undue influence. They've often been accused of being able to buy politicians, basically. Do you think cyberspace in governance has opened up new ground for those lobbyists, or has it in a way maybe leveled the playing field slightly, as you don't have to find your way into Congress to get noticed anymore?
Yeah, it's an interesting point. The tech lobby is very well organized and has actually partnered with the advertising industry. So you really have two industries arm in arm trying to deflect regulations that would inhibit their profitability. So in the United States, most of the activity that's been happening has actually been on the state level. And I think the relationship of state regulations versus federal regulations has been a key dynamic here, meaning that California passed a California Consumer Privacy Act in the wake of Cambridge Analytica and the many Facebook scandals, and created, at least at the state level, something that is starting to approach the European model, and other states have now started. And so the lobbyists are very active at the state level. So for example, Virginia passed a law that's much weaker than the California law. So you're seeing a kind of competition of legal ideas and policy at the state level, and you're seeing the lobbyists and the activists kind of battle it out. Simultaneously, you have some bills in Washington, D.C. that are being floated around, but no consensus yet on where that's going. But always you hear the same refrains from tech lobbyists that lawsuits would inhibit small businesses, and you hear that undue regulation will inhibit innovation. You hear it, the same things you always hear. But what is different is activists and people interested in reform have very powerful arguments that the lobbyists don't have good answers to. So at least the tide has turned in that respect.
Okay, Stéphane, I think you had a comment there. Go ahead.
Sorry, I was looking for the mic. In the context, for example, on content moderation for terrorist content was quite close to the topic some years ago when working in Europe. You would have exactly this discourse about big companies explaining that whatever regulation will come in this space is going to impact the whole model. But when we were discussing with small companies, I mean the one with 1, 2, 3 employees, having suddenly within months a business model that was quite global, they were in need of help in order to help with how to make sure that their platform was not becoming haven for criminals or for terrorists. So this whole argument about regulation, oversight, multi-stakeholder participation to flagging content, because to Samir's points before, you could argue it's not the responsibility of the companies to look into the content itself, but at least it's their responsibility to accept help when help is coming, specifically when it's from civil society and multi-stakeholder. Shielding both ends, saying this is not my responsibility, but at the same time I'm going to do this on my own without taking help in order to limit oversight. It's not manageable.
Okay. We're down to like our last, I think, 4 minutes now, or actually 6 minutes. So I've got 3 minutes for Madeleine and for Samir. If we can wrap up, some final thoughts on what we've heard over the last 90 minutes would be great, and as well as if you want to address the last issue presented. Samir, do go ahead.
No, so I'll just come in with a short comment. I think the US is a flawed system. Europe is trying to get it right. India is trying to find its median. We are all struggling, right? But I think the real innovation hubs of the future are not these largely liberal and partially open or fully open societies. I think, please understand, everything you're trying to protect against is going to be developed, curated, and promoted in different geographies as well. And I think the biggest challenge in the 21st century, in the fourth IR, in the digital age, is that how do we encourage the real powerhouse of innovation for this century, China, to become a responsible global actor? America at its worst, or rather at its hegemonic worst, still had a penetrated democracy. I could stand outside the White House and protest against the tobacco lobby. I could do that with a placard, and I could go to their lawmakers and I could petition their lawyers, however expensive they were, David. Now try doing that in Beijing and you will probably get a different answer. So I think the 21st century digital age is incomplete without a responsible China. And I'm not being critical of China, I'm rather being encouraging of China to understand that they have a global responsibility and they will have to open up funnels and channels and conversations with communities and societies they impact all over the world. And I think unless you bring China on board, the US can move so far and no further, and Europe will have to do the monkey balancing act it has been trying to do for a while now.
Yeah, Samir, you did. I apologize for not drawing on the China issue. It seemed to be more your area of expertise, but I do very much appreciate you bringing it into this conversation because you're probably right. It is something that will need to be considered on a very wide scale going forward. Madeleine, your final thoughts then, last 3 minutes, especially given what Samir has just said.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. I think that's so good to say. So overall, looking back at this panel, I think we are more or less aligned. I hear a lot of importance of multinational solutions. At the same time, we also know that it's going to take a while to get there, that we are expecting the Brussels effect to kick in, but that will also not be tomorrow. So given the fact that we have no time to waste, honestly, because of the scale and the urgency of the problem, it's better just to start with a multidimensional solution where citizens, consumers are helped to be empowered and to see also the other side of the disinformation debate and the big tech disruption by media and information literacy, empowering editorial and journalism as one way to make sure that at least there is another sound to be heard or another line to be read. Those elements are really important, and we should not stop now doing that. And at the same time, like we have with larger other societal problems, you always see that if citizens are really getting enough of stuff, think for instance on eating meat, what you see in many European countries right now, citizens are just eating less meat because that is not good for the animal welfare, and at the same time, it's also not a good idea for our global environmental situation. So you would see citizens start voting with their feet. And I can also imagine that in this social media where there will be more and more people that realize that they are looking for alternatives that are better respecting their rights. So I also want to emphasize that we have to, as long as we don't have the best global solution, which will take a while, just have multidimensional efforts and have citizens play an important role there as well and empower them to do the right thing.
We just have a minute left. David, I'll come back to you then. I mean, a lot of faith in empowering citizens there. Do you have as much faith in that being part of the solution? Do you think the citizens can step up and do the right things?
I, have tried to make an example of what an individual citizen can do, and there are serious limits to what an individual can do. So to put the responsibility on individuals to solve the problem is misguided. This is a collective issue that requires everyone around the world to acknowledge that it's not our fault that we are addicted to social media, but we do need to work together to find improvements for the future.
And work together at the highest levels possible. Actually, Stéphane, 30 seconds, very quickly.
I agree. There's a paradox that citizens are living in the sense that they are absolutely mistrusting any technical solution coming, for example, from states, but they're installing all the apps in the world possible on their phone that is getting all their personal data. So there's something to address there. If we want to empower civilians, is also to make sure that this kind of schizophrenia is addressed, and that the trust in the authorities that are supposed to help people is restored, and there the responsibility is more towards government in order to create that space for people.
Great final comments. Stéphane Duguin, we will leave it there. I'd like to thank Samir Saran, Madeleine de Kock-Boening, and David Carroll all so much for being with us on this session. Really a great discussion. And that ends this session of the TRT World Forum on Digital Governance, Policymaking and Statecraft in the Digital Age. Thanks so much for joining us.